Our last but not least speaker tonight is Madeline Gleeson. I know that Madeline's already done some extraordinary work speaking to parliamadarians here in the UK, and we're calling on her to speak to you all this evening. She's a lawyer and senior research fellow at the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law in Australia. The purpose of her centre is to inject evidence-based research into migration and asylum debates. Wow, it would be amazing to have some of that in our debates over here too. She's the author of Offshore, Behind the Wire on Manus and Nauru, and she has written multiple reports and articles about Australia's offshore detention policy. I'll hand over to you, Madeline.
Thank you very much, Bella, and thank you to everybody else and the other speakers. I wanted to start by apologising to Elahe and everyone else who was subject to this policy by my government, and warn everyone else on the call that you never want to feel the guilt, or as Dr. Martin said, the shame that comes with knowledge that your government, your country did this to human beings. So I can only urge in the strongest possible terms that you learn from the mistakes we made in Australia and heed the warning that this case study offers, and don't go down the same incredibly problematic path that we did. In considering this policy, the humanitarian and medical concerns should be foremost, and those have been so well articulated by the other panellists. I know that Bella, you and in the chat as well, people have mentioned how shocking and how powerful that testimony is. From my perspective, I think it's actually incredibly restrained. If you knew the full truth of what it was like for people offshore, you would be deeply traumatized. And I say that because I know, because I met with and spoke with many of the people who have also worked there or been there or seen there. And I'm talking about former military, police, others who would consider themselves traditionally quite right-wing, very tough on immigration, or alternatively incredibly apolitical and not really having a view on this either way, just seeing themselves perhaps as working offshore as a job. And I've seen what their experiences offshore have done to them as human beings and the trauma that has inflicted. And this is not even just the people who were detained and actually subjected to the worst of it. This is people who worked there even sometimes just for a short period of time. But what was witnessed offshore struck to the core of these people, many of whom had worked in war zones and in difficult situations. It was absolutely shocking and traumatizing. So while the statements you've heard today are powerful, and there are others out there as well that are powerful, I don't think anything can truly capture the level of horror that is involved in offshore processing. I wanted to pick up on a point that Elahe said very correctly and powerfully, which was that this is a policy designed to torture people. And exactly as she said, it is designed to apply pressure on people who have come seeking asylum in a way which is deemed the inappropriate way. It is to put pressure on them, perhaps to return back to persecution and serious human rights violations. And it's also trying to make an example of them at their cost to try and deter people from travelling also by boat in the future. And it is absolutely done with full knowledge and approval of the Australian government. To understand why it's important to go to the core of the problem with a deterrence-based immigration policy, which is a more general issue than just offshore processing, but it's the issue from which offshore processing emerges. If a policy is going to be based on deterrence, such that deterrence is its one and only mission, that means that a country like Australia had to subject people arriving by boat to conditions which were as bad or worse than what they fled. And there had to be absolutely no exceptions for children and other vulnerable groups, as Dr. Martin said, for others who might arrive sick and injured. If this is a policy to which the UK plans to commit itself, it must be willing to go down that path to the very end, no matter what, no matter the humanitarian consequences. Because if you start sending some people offshore but not others, or carving out the exceptions that would be necessary for basic medical and humanitarian purposes, then quickly the entire policy would fall apart. So I'm happy to take further questions on that later if it's of interest, but I think it's a really important message to remember that as soon as the driving motivation for a policy moves away from protection and becomes deterrence, any country that does that must be willing to see that through to the end. And Australia provides a case study of what that end looks like. And as I mentioned, it's horrifying. While the humanitarian and medical concerns should be foremost and should on their own be sufficient to rule this out as a policy, I will speak briefly to the cost, because that is something which has also been mentioned and is important to consider. This policy cost Australia billions of dollars, and it continues to do so. So the costs are escalating with each passing year, despite the fact that we have not sent any new arrivals offshore since 2014. And currently there are less than 230 people left offshore. So even though we've stopped transferring years ago, and even though there's almost no one left offshore, the costs continue to grow with each passing year. Beyond the sheer size of the cost is the fact that these costs have always been impossible to predict or budget for, because the nature of this policy is so difficult to plan in a structured and organised way. There are so many curveballs and factors out of the control of the government that you will not only be spending billions, but you will have no control, or it will be impossible to predict how those costs will emerge or what their size will be, which for a government that's trying to manage its budget is incredibly difficult. The point was made that much of that money will be going out of your country. It will be going to foreign governments, and it will be going to multinational corporations. So that's billions of dollars leaving the UK, going elsewhere. And finally, it will be going elsewhere, and the government will need to justify this expense for a policy that is unlikely to work. In Australia, this policy did not work to deter people from seeking asylum by boat. In the first year of offshore processing, the number of people travelling to Australia by boat continued to increase so much that more asylum seekers arrived by boat in that first year than at any other time in recorded history, since the 1970s, when asylum seekers first started to come to Australia by boat. So it's not an effective policy. It is incredibly destructive. It also costs a huge amount. I mean, the concerns could go on and on, but really I think that should be enough, more than enough on its own, to demonstrate that this was a policy failure here. Even we have moved to get away from it. We don't do this anymore. So I urge the UK to learn from our mistakes and not do it either.